Okay, everybody, welcome to our final lecture. This is a lecture on the book of Job. As you can see, this is an illustration of Job and his friends. And here's the usual joke. Please take outline notes during this lecture as it will be part of the final exam. Okay, let's start by checking our assumptions. Take a few minutes to write in your notebook. You can pause the video as necessary. This is what I would like you to write. Write about a time when you had bad luck, an accident, or when you felt misunderstood, or when you felt underappreciated. For example, having your application rejected, or maybe your significant other leaves you. And answer the question, why did this happen? So pause the video now and answer that question. It doesn't have to be a long answer. When you're finished, resume the video. Okay, now, since we're not having this lecture live, you can talk about it with another person on your own time, but the idea is to get a sense of where you attribute bad luck, where you attribute misfortune. Okay, moving on to the. So the question that the book of Job poses is, does life make sense? Does life make sense? Or do we attribute sense to it after the fact, or something else? All right, so starting with the basics, why did we read the book of Job? Well, this is one of the most important books in the Middle Ages and in ancient times as well. This book is part of the Hebrew Bible, and as such, it's an important book. It's part of the Christian Bible. As such, it's an important book for the West. And if you collect it together with the Poetics, which we read last week, and the Song of Songs, which we will read next term as the first text, these are some of the three most widely read texts in the Middle Ages and even the ancient world. In other words, these texts helped shape our society, Western society then, and they continue to do so now. Not to mention they've been part of a good educational foundation for millennia. Many influential Western authors wrote at book length on Job. In other words, many people wrote a whole book on the book of Job, such as Gregory the Great, William Blake, and Carl Jung. Gregory the Great was a Catholic pope, the head of the Roman Catholic Church. He was the one who sent Christian missionaries to England to Christianize the barbarians living there. William Blake was a great poet and illustrator. He was the one who made the illustrations we've been looking at up in the right corner of your screen. And Carl Jung was one of the founding fathers of psychology. All of these people found Job, the book of Job, so meaningful that they wrote a book about it. So this book has been in conversation for a long time. Nearly every significant Christian theologian has written on the book of Job. For example, Augustine, whom we will read soon, who was a Neoplatonist. And many others have called Job the greatest book or poem in history. For example, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Daniel Webster, and Victor Hugo. So clearly, this book as poetry is something special, and this book as a book touches a nerve. So what is the book of Job? Well, as I said, it's part of Hebrew scripture. It's part of the Christian Old Testament. And it's a book of poetry, framed by a prose introduction and prose conclusion. One of the reasons I asked you to read the translation we read was because the translation I gave you is poetry. Many translations are prose, so a lot is missing. I gave you a poetic translation. And it's also good poetry. It's poetry of high quality. It's long and it's well composed. We can't always say that about ancient texts. Sometimes we read things just because they're old and they help us understand the past, but this is actually quite a remarkable poem, as are the works of Homer. What else is the book of Job? Well, it's an inquiry. It's an inquiry into the perennial and universal problem of suffering. It's semi-dialogic. In other words, there's a bit of dialogue here, a back and forth. We know how important dialogue was for Greek culture after Plato and Socrates, his teacher, had this idea that by talking things out, we can get to the bottom of things. And I think I mentioned that Aristotle's school was known as the Peripatetics because they walked around talking, trying to figure out reality. So this is a book called, written, I don't know, a few decades ago, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. This is I guess this is by a Jewish rabbi who took up the very same question as the book of Job. Why do bad things happen to good people? This is a question which I suppose everyone must answer for themselves, especially if they've done some suffering. This is a television show which broaches the same subject. I suppose it's getting a little dated now. I think it was on the air when I first came to Taiwan. This is about a man who has to go back and fix every wrong thing he's done. So, the book of Job, as we read it, is actually a reboot. It's a modernized version, an updated version of an old moral tale called Job the Patient. Job the Patient, we don't have Job the Patient anymore, but it's mentioned. It was probably a much simpler view of divine justice, and it existed ante quem 587 before the Common Era. So sometime before 587 in the Common Era, we have knowledge of a poem, probably much simpler than the one you read, called Job the Patient, and it was a simple moral tale about a man who just wouldn't give up his faith in God. This is clearly a theme in Jewish literature. Now, a century or more later, a Judean poet turned the moral folk tale, Job the Patient, into a poetic inquiry in the form of an argument among four friends. And that's what we get in the book of Job. It's a long dialogic argument among four friends about the nature of suffering. It's an extreme case. Lawyers do this today when they come up with laws. Legislators, they think, okay, so what would be the extreme case? They try to test the limits of a theory or an idea by hypothesizing an extreme case. Fiction often does this too. Myths often do this. So what the book of Job does for us as scholars and students of literature is it makes suffering evident. Job's extreme suffering, since it's so extreme and so easy to see, it makes visible the contradictions in everyone's suffering. So when I asked you at the beginning of this lecture where you attribute bad luck, this is an exercise I usually do in class, and almost everyone in the class usually says, attributes suffering to something outside themselves, which is really strange because no one can really say why. So everyone has this implicit faith in bad things happening for some reason. And that's a very interesting idea, which is to say that this book, the question that this book poses, is still relevant today to you and to me. So the central theme of Job, of course, is unmerited suffering, suffering that someone doesn't deserve. We know this because we see at the beginning Job was a perfect man, and the only reason he's suffering is because God agrees to make a bet with the accuser, with Satan. The exaggerated, dramatized presentation in our text helps make this understandable. This is one of the chief powers of fictional narrative. As I said, with law cases and things like this, and with myths, we often consider extreme cases because just like a caricature of someone, an extreme case, makes the truth of something more easily read, more easily understood. Another way we could define Job is axial age wisdom. There's a kind of wisdom literature that belongs not only to Israel at this time, but to many other countries. Okay, I think that. Sorry for the repetition. Okay, so let's talk about Job as a genre. Job, generically speaking, is a fable. It's fabular. Not fabulous, it's fabular. It's a fable. Job is presented as a Gentile, which means he's a non-Jew who lives in a non-specified time of an unnamed lineage. Now this would mark for a Jewish reader something like the world of make-believe. This is a hypothesis. This is a test case. If you'll notice in the Bible, when an historical character is introduced, we always get his lineage or her lineage. We get who her father and mother were, actually who the parents are, who the father is. So Job is specifically marked as a kind of hypothesis, kind of an everyman figure. Fables create a kind of liminal world in which we can all see ourselves. It makes the point of identification in fiction all the more easier because it's not so specific. Excuse me. So if you think of the beginning of Star Wars, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, that also creates distance from the viewer to create universal identification. So Star Wars, in a way, is about the United States in the 1970s when it was created, but at the same time, by putting it in a galaxy far, far away, it creates this space between us and between our reality and the reality of the fiction, so that just about anybody can fit into it. We can all sort of identify with one character or another character or maybe several characters in a fiction like this. Likewise, Job calls his god El and Shaddai. These are older Hebrew names for what eventually became known by the Tetragrammaton. The Tetragrammaton is YHWH. These are 4 consonants in Hebrew language, and without the vowels, they're not pronounceable, and they're written that way deliberately because for Semitic religions, Judaism and Islam, the name of God is sacred and holy. So let's talk about Shaddai. This is one of the names, as I said, that Job uses of God. And it's kind of an old-sounding name, even when the book of Job was written. This term Shaddai has an ambiguous origin. We don't know. It's debated. It might mean the destroyer. It might mean the mountain dweller. It might mean a pair of breasts, referring to fertility. And so, so there's a lot we don't know about the book of Job. Okay, getting back to the genre. So, in a simple way, we can say Job is wisdom literature, Job is axial age literature, and we can also say Job is a lyric poem. A lyric poem. In other words, it's a poem not about a story so much. The many figures of speech, the apostrophes, the exclamations, and the predominance of emotion, as opposed to action, and the interchanges make the poem lyrical. In other words whose meaning is in the sound and form. Lyricism is a quality of words where the sound is just as important as the content and the form. So Job has these qualities. It's hard for us to hear because we're reading a translation, but I suppose if we were Hebrew scholars, it would be much clearer. So this is to say that Job, the book of Job, advances its argument through rhetoric and through figure, not only through reasoning. So if we read the book of Job like a book of philosophy, we won't get it. Part of the meaning of the book of Job is in the rhetoric and the figures of thought and the figures of speech and in the sound. So yes, we're losing a lot in translation, as always. This means that to understand the text, we have to understand the emotions that the lyric poem evokes in us. We have to perform a calculus of symbols. We have to perform a summation of emotional states in order to arrive at the message of the text. It's not enough just to get the plot. The way things are told, the sound of things that are told, the way things are figured are all part of the meaning. Another way to talk about the genre of Job, and we're basically just defining it when we're talking about the genre, is to say that Job, the book of Job, generically speaking, is distantly related to Plato's dialogues on human, existential, and metaphysical issues, right? Plato wrote dialogues in which the main character is Socrates, and Socrates is talking about the human condition and how we got here, where we go after death, what the meaning of it all is. These are existential and metaphysical issues. The book of Job is also an erotema. It's an asking questions which imply an answer. Okay, now, if we were together in class, I would have you have some discussion. What I really want you to do for the small group discussion, I would really like you individually to try to fill out. There are discussion questions on Seba, and I want you to fill out the allegory. There's a chart, I forget which number it is, but you'll see it. There's a chart in the middle of the first page of the discussion questions, and there's 2 rows to fill in. First, you write out everyone's response to Job's suffering. Job's wife, and some of the friends, and so on. And then, to fill out the allegory, you write what that means. And when you do the allegorical level, just remember that in an allegory, there's everything that's a person, place, or thing becomes something abstract. So if you have people or things at the literal level, those people or things must disappear at the allegorical level. They must become ideas. All right, so let's get back. What is the message of the book of Job? Well, scholars tell us that Judean audiences felt that the book of Job was conclusive, that the meaning was quite clear, the message was distinct, it was clear, not hard to get to, although modern readers might not feel the same way. We might have the same experience reading Genesis 22, for example, or Genesis 1 for that matter, and the tree of knowledge. Right? We saw this before, that there's a difference between the ancient world and our world. The ancient world had a fear of knowledge. They had a sense of knowledge as some knowledge as prohibited, belonging only to God or gods. We don't feel that way. We live in a scientific paradigm where we think all knowledge is available to us, and our job is to pursue it. If you continue to take this course all the way through European literature, you'll see that you'll see when this idea comes up. It comes up in the Renaissance. People like Paracelsus who say that God wants us to understand things, which was a radical departure from the ancient world. So, for example, if we say that early audiences would be satisfied with the message that, hey, you can't understand everything, right? Because at the end of the text, Job says, I just want to know what the answer is. Why is this happening? And God says, who are you to ask? Where were you when I created the universe? And you'll see that these same sorts of pronunciations happen in some of the other texts we read, right? In the Enuma Elish, in Gilgamesh, we have these same pronunciations. You know, they were there when the well springs of the world were created. But how about you and me? Are you satisfied with a God proclaiming himself inscrutable? Inscrutable means you can't think about it. So at the end, Yahweh appears to Job as a whirlwind, as a tornado, which is a natural symbol for something powerful and scary and hard to understand. And Job says, okay, I'll just shut up. I shut up now, and I'm satisfied. Now, Job curses his birth during the course of the text, and he asks for answers from his God, but he maintains his innocence. And this he does in the face of enormous social pressure. So if you'll notice, as you read the book of Job, or as you read the book of Job, everyone thought he must be to blame. We know, as the reader, we have a privileged position. There's a special irony where we know that Job is innocent. Job is set up as an innocent man, and we see that it is in the court of heaven that this wager is set up between basically what we would now call God and the devil just does it to test. It's just a test of Job. Why the test? That's a question that you should consider. Why do gods test human beings? So the first thing that happens is Job's wife says, hey, just curse God and die. And the reason she says that is because if you were to curse God, supposedly God would strike you down. And Job's wife is often made fun of in literature. But really, I think she's doing her role as a nurturer, because in a traditional family, the woman, the mother, the wife is the nurturer. And the last thing she wants to see is anyone in her family suffering. So he's recommending that Job take the easy way out. Just die and get the suffering over with. And it's finished at least. So I don't take Job's wife's answer to be anything negative. I take it to be the right response for her role. So, sorry about that. Job's friends all try to attribute fault to him. They say, well, you must be at fault in some way or another. So this is a lot of social pressure. Everybody around Job is saying it must be your fault. You must have done something wrong. And Job says, no, I didn't do anything wrong. So for us, part of the meaning of the text is Job's bravery, his clarity of mind. In the end, Yahweh rewards Job's insight that his suffering is unjust. So Job is rewarded in the end because he didn't change his mind. And God, Yahweh, the character Yahweh, says as much, that your friends were wrong. As I said, we know, we have a privileged position as a reader, that Job's suffering is unjust. And this creates a kind of horrible dramatic irony. In some way, we as readers are complicit with the accuser, the devil. because we've known from the very beginning that Job is innocent, and this is part of the way the poem works. We have to watch Job suffer, knowing that it's not his fault. And we almost, since we were in the court of heaven when it happened, we are almost complicit. So let me show you this painting. This is called Las Meninas by Diego Velázquez. This belongs to an entirely different epic, but it's related thematically to what we're doing. In this painting, this is a Baroque painting, and if you hang on until European Literature 1, you'll hear more about this. In this painting, you'll notice that what is depicted is the painter painting. On the left side of the canvas, you have Velázquez with a cross, a red cross on his chest. He's the artist, and he's painting. And what we see on the far left is the back side of the canvas he's painting. So beside him is the princess, attended by two women, and on the right we have dwarves and a dog. A dwarf, a dog, and attendants to the princess are not the kind of people that are supposed to be in a royal painting. Velázquez worked for the kings. If you'll notice, the king and the queen are in the far back of the room, in the center of the picture, reflected in a mirror. In other words, you and I, as viewers, are occupying the place of the king and the queen. So Velázquez, being a master of optics and perspective, puts you and me in the place of the king and queen. Now, what does that have to do with Job? Well, that has to do with the book of Job insofar as we are complicit. We get to see things that no one else sees, right? So that's part of the way this text works. The author puts us in the middle of it, is what I'm saying. So, right, so here we are. What is the message of the book of Job? For a modern reader, an almighty God who tests his own creation is an ethical problem, right? If human beings rescue dogs and try not to swat flies, some Buddhists try not to swat flies if you didn't know, can the creator of all torture us on a bet? It doesn't sound good, right? And along these lines of thought, is it enough for God to tell us, you can't understand anyway, or you're nothing compared to other creatures I've made? This is how Yahweh answers Job. You can't understand anyway, and you're nothing compared to other creatures I've made. Where were you when I created the Leviathan, the whale? It doesn't seem very satisfying for someone who was born in the age of science, you and I. Yahweh, the character, can't say Job deserved his suffering because it was out of pride that Yahweh allowed Job to be tortured. Because the accuser challenged Yahweh, and Yahweh had to see if Job was really innocent or not, if Job would hold his faith. And of course he did. So how do we do this? Can we salvage this text from our condemnation as old morality related to tribal monotheism? In other words, when we meet an old text like this, and it seems to be that the morality just doesn't go with our modern times, for example, Abraham being obedient to God by threatening to kill his own son, is there any way to make sense of this in our time when it would be morally reprehensible to think of such a thing? Yes, there is a way to salvage it. We can read Job allegorically. This is why I asked you to do the exercise in the discussion questions about allegory. An allegory is something like, it's a story. It's something like an extended metaphor, a narrative, in which people, places, and things have a second meaning or a third meaning or several secondary meanings that are not literal. In an allegory, looks like I might be repeating myself here. In an allegory, persons, places, actions, and things become abstract concepts, which means we are not literally implying that any God allowed his own child to be tortured and then yells in his face, raging like a storm, which is literally what happened in this story. I think if this were to happen today, you could call the child abuse hotline. So, we're going to end here with our discussion. Another issue that the book of Job brings up is this. It brings up the issue of the ineffable. One of the themes of the book of Job is the ineffable. The ineffable literally means that which cannot be pronounced. But the modern meaning is that which you can't describe with words, and maybe that which you can't think about with concepts. Now, we've run into this before when we talked about myth. but there is an entire body of literature, an entire set of techniques for dealing with the ineffable. And one of our doctoral students, Rados Kulteti, is going to talk to you about the ineffable and the literature of nonsense. And that's the end of our presentation. And I'm not sure quite how to stop the recording.